All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're going to untangle a really fascinating historical knot. We're talking about a serious charge of plagiarism leveled against a 19th century prophet and one of his most well-known works. So, here's the central question, the big mystery we're looking into. Was Joseph Smith's new translation of the Bible a work of divine revelation, like he claimed, or was he secretly leaning on a popular Bible commentary that was around at the time? Okay, so what's the accusation? It's actually pretty simple. Critics claimed that when Joseph Smith was working on his translation of the Bible, he wasn't just getting divine inspiration. He was actually copying from a famous commentary by a man named Adam Clarke.
Now, the first thing critics point to is the timing. You can see here that Adam Clarke's huge multi-volume commentary was already out there, fully published and available, for years before Smith even started his translation work. So for the critics, this is like Exhibit A. It proves he had the opportunity, right? The book was there for the taking.
But what's the actual evidence? Well, the whole case really boils down to just a handful of verses where some specific, explanatory phrases in Smith's translation seem to echo, almost word for word, the language used in Clarke's commentary.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty and actually look at these textual similarities. This is the stuff that fuels the entire debate.
And here we go. This slide really gets to the heart of it. On one side, you've got Clarke, who's writing a commentary. He's just explaining the scripture. But on the other side, you have Smith, who claimed to be revising the scripture itself. Critics see this and say, aha, Smith just lifted those clarifying phrases right out of Clarke's explanation and stuck them directly into his own inspired text. To them, it looks like a smoking gun. So the logic here is really straightforward. Step 1, Clarke's book came first. Step 2, there are some phrases that sound alike. Step 3, they assume that similarity must mean copying. And therefore, step 4, the conclusion is plagiarism. It seems simple, right? But is that the whole story? And this is where the whole story just takes a massive turn. You see, the case seems pretty convincing when you're zoomed in like that. But once you zoom out and look at the sheer scale of the project, well, that changes everything. Less than 1%. Think about that for a second. That's the total percentage of verses in the entire Joseph Smith translation that show any kind of real similarity to Clarke's commentary. Let that sink in. Less than 1%. And why does that tiny number matter so much? Because Smith's translation modifies thousands of verses. If he were really using Clarke as a source book, you'd expect to see Clarke's fingerprints all over the place. But you don't. The vast majority of changes show zero connection to Clarke. And get this, many of Smith's changes actually flat out contradict Clarke's theology. That's not really what a plagiarist does, is it?
And that brings us to an even bigger problem for the plagiarism claim, one that goes way beyond just a few similar words. We're talking about the core theology, the fundamental beliefs of each man.
I mean, just look at this. These two are worlds apart. Clarke was a traditional Trinitarian. He believed God was a spirit who created everything out of nothing. Smith's theology? The complete opposite. A Godhead of three distinct beings, an embodied God with a physical form, and a creation organized from matter that already existed. These aren't minor disagreements. These are foundational, irreconcilable differences. And that's really the whole point right here. If Smith was truly relying on Clarke for his ideas, you would absolutely expect to see Clarke's theology popping up in the translation, but it's just not there at all. The doctrinal DNA, you could say, simply does not match. So, if it's not plagiarism, what's a better explanation for those few similarities? Well, the argument is that both men were basically swimming in the same linguistic ocean. They lived in a culture that was just saturated with the language of the King James Bible. It was the air they breathed. And sharing a common style that comes from your culture isn't the same thing as copying from a specific source. So what's the verdict here? Are we looking at solid evidence of a crime, or is it something else? Let's break down the final conclusion from the research.
This source argues that the entire plagiarism claim is built on a logical mistake. It's called an inference fallacy. It's the error of building a conclusion on a pile of assumptions instead of actual evidence. It's the logic that says, well, he could have read the book, so he must have copied it. You see the leap? It's conjecture, not a solid chain of evidence.
So let's just recap the counter-argument. First, the scale of the overlap is incredibly tiny, almost statistically irrelevant. Second, their core theologies are polar opposites. Third, the similar language is much better explained by the culture they both lived in. And maybe most importantly, there is zero direct historical evidence, no letters, no journals, no notes, that Smith ever accessed or used Clarke's commentary for his translation. Nothing.
And so the conclusion is this. A few instances of similar phrasing, when you weigh them against a mountain of textual and theological differences, just don't add up. It's not credible evidence of borrowing.
And really, this all leaves us with a much bigger question, one that goes way beyond this specific case. In a world where we all draw from a shared culture and a shared language, where do you draw that line between being influenced by something and outright plagiarizing it? Now that is something worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us.